So, I've had a few conversations so far today around this topic that I'm going to speak about today, and I realized maybe I'm making a lot of assumptions as to the level of knowledge that people are coming into. Can I get a quick show of hands of who has heard of GPT-3? Even if you don't know what it is, you okay? Okay? That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Okay. You guys are safe. If you haven't heard of it, I can't promise anything, but I'll try and do my best. So, modern advances in machine learning modeling techniques have given us lots of interesting results, some even useful ones. And this is particularly useful when you kind of start thinking about the human experience. And a lot of that resolves around communication or language. Pretend you didn't see that. So GPT, or Generative Pre-trained Transformer 3, nothing to do with transformers, by the way, is all about language models, all about language machine learning models. And GPT addresses this at its very core through something called the transformer network architecture, which I'll try and cover in about 5 minutes. So good luck to you guys, but that's kind of it. Is anyone here familiar with Wait But Why? Again, quick show of hands if anyone's seen these blogs. Okay, yeah. So I've plagiarized them here, but I've given them credit. They've written a really epic series on the human civilization and how technology has taken part into giving us advances and the milestones that have kind of resulted in the crazy and amazing world that we live in today. One of those sort of chapters in that series is called Us, and by us they mean humans. And they kind of cover this point in a really great way. I think they've got loads of great visuals. That's kind of why I'd recommend it. By the way, anyone who's not heard of this, to give it a go. But just that first sentence, language is so magical because it allows individual brains to connect like neurons to form a larger thinking system. Or essentially, language is awesome because it allows us to leverage our collective thinking as a people. And actually, fundamentally, I think that's why I personally find GPT-3 so interesting. It kind of addresses this very human thing. And generally, I think some of the performance of GPT-3 so far has given credence to machine learning as something that's going to help us really bridge that gap in between human and machine or software. Why does it matter? Sam Altman tweeted this, July 17th, 2020. Wow, just got my access to GPT-3 and my mind is blown. Here are my thoughts, very long thread that follows. That pretty much summarizes how I felt when I started seeing demos going viral on Twitter of people typing in a few instructions and generating realistic code segments, or people typing in a few sentences and getting full Figma designs for full apps. It was a mixture of excitement, it was a mixture of concern, fear. I'm a software developer, so I kind of see the end in sight. But generally, I think this is awesome. It's really cool tech. Keep in mind that date, July 17, 2020, which is, by the way, just about a month before the initial release of GPT-3. 2 days later, July 19th, same person. The GPT-3 hype is way too much. It's impressive, thanks for the compliments, blah, 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 but basically, calm down, everyone. And actually, I think this is a key point, and I kind of like the duality of what Sam Altman captured there. But this is very early days in what will be a very long journey. Don't get overexcited by some of the results, and I'll try and touch on exactly why that's an important point, actually. So Sam Altman is actually the CEO of OpenAI. He's the former president of Y Combinator. OpenAI was founded in 2015 by Sam and our favorite superhero / supervillain, Elon Musk. Don't think Elon has as much to do with it nowadays. But their original mission was essentially to stop the plot from the Matrix becoming a reality, or basically just trying to make sure AI was leveraged for the common good of people. Fast forward to today, it's pretty much still the same objective, but they've shifted from a non-profit to a profit model. They've also got a really deep partnership with Microsoft, where they can benefit from not only loads of cash, of course, but also computing power and data. Microsoft's hand with GitHub now makes a lot of sense with me and my knowledge of this, and I'll hopefully be able to touch on that later. I think it's worth taking a step back to kind of understand the predecessor to GPT-3, so I'm sure you guys can guess, GPT-2. And actually, the way that OpenAI has taken their approach to experimenting with this model and this technology has been to take an iterative approach with how much data it can compute, how many parameters the models have. So parameters is essentially a proxy for how complex the things that it can do, or the entities that it can model. For reference, GPT-2 started with about 117 million parameters. That was small. Few years later, or a few months later even, get up to 1.5 billion parameters, which is a huge, huge difference. And for context, GPT-3, so the next iteration of this, is about 175 billion parameters. So that's 100x of what GPT-2 extra large was. This was released in about 2019, if I remember correctly, maybe a bit earlier than that. And even the performance of this modeling, natural language processing modeling technique was pretty amazing at the time. You can imagine, I guess, the scale that we're able to achieve with the next iteration. So the training data is also a very relevant part. I think there's two core aspects, like scale, volume, in terms of data and parameters. GPT-3 has been trained since 2017 January, so just over 4 years. Still being trained to this day. It's trained from a variety of sources, mostly newswire text from 1950 to about 2005, a mixture of news articles from around the world, digital encyclopedias, Google, the internet, basically taking on all of the best and worst parts of the human condition captured via the web. So what does it actually do? I'm going to let you guys absorb that first. I've learned from experience that if I talk and things are going on, you guys won't listen to me. So focus on this first, which is basically going to capture what I'm about to follow in words. That language models essentially predict output from input. It's really that. All it is at its core is probability, a probabilistic function that given some output, given some data that's trained, has been able to craft a sort of internal representation of words or tokens or vectors, as they're called in machine learning. And it uses a bunch of crazy maths, linear algebra for the math buffs in here, to derive a probabilistic output of what it thinks is likely to follow in that sentence. And these sequencing problems are actually quite commonplace in the natural language processing sphere. To take a slightly higher level view, this is kind of picturing the same thing, just with a few more components. So you've got your input, which is a word like cat. I'm sure you guys can tell I'm a cat guy. You turn that into a vectorized form, so that's basically a numeric representation of that word or that token. You have your training data, which allows you to give yourself an internal representation of that word or that token as it relates to other words in your training data. You get a probabilistic model of what things follow and what things are likely to follow and what things are not likely to follow, and then you get some output at the end, which is hopefully a sensible, grammatically logical word in a sentence. And GPT-3 at its core, that's all it does, right? It's not anything else besides this. It takes in an input, uses training data, uses probability, and provides us with hopefully something useful as an output. The one special piece around GPT-3 and slightly few other machine learning algorithms, however, is all related to this paper that was released in 2017 by a bunch of people that are far smarter than myself around a different network architecture proposal called the Transformer, hence the T in GPT-3. Generative, because it generates output, pre-trained, because it's pre-trained, and Transformer, because of the model architecture that it uses, which is derived from this paper. I'm going to try my best to kind of cover that in about 2 minutes, like actually why this thing is important, what it's useful for. And I'm going to try and visualize it, but before I do that, I'll give you the sort of word format of that. So typically in sequencing or language problems, one of the key aspects to getting a meaningful output is keeping the context that you get from the previous words, right? And I think that kind of makes sense, even if you don't know anything about machine learning. To get some sort of sensible output, you're going to have to keep context about what came before. Quite a difficult problem to do, particularly as you start to scale up the text that you're training on. Usually it goes fine for short sentences, paragraphs. There's loads of actually different topologies and network architectures like RNNs, recurrent neural networks, that address this quite well. However, they all suffer from the same fundamental problem that the larger the text gets, the harder that context it's able to keep. So it works fine for sentences essentially, but if you're trying to train a RNN on a whole book and you're generating a sentence, typically you'll only get the last few paragraphs at best that to derive the context of the output. The attention mechanism, or which is basically what the transformer network uses, basically allows you to solve the problem of infinite context, right? So this is kind of what I was talking about before. Context, you're mapping how the different words relate to each other, trying to make sure you capture the things that are relevant. And the problem with RNNs is that they're limited, or previous networks, they're limited by their window of attention. Whereas the attention network allows you to capture the entire attention mechanism, the entire text that you're training the data on. Pretty revolutionary because actually it means that if you train your network with loads of data, you can get some pretty interesting results, right? It's actually benefiting from everything that's previously learned. Which is actually a big flaw in a lot of machine learning models, right? We, as humans, like we don't have to retrain ourselves every time we see something new. We can sort of benefit and cross-benefit from stuff that we've learned before. And it's been a real struggle trying to get machine learning algorithms to have an intuitive way of doing that. So, how people have been using this so far? A bunch of ways. OpenAI have released a really amazing UI interface pictured here on the right with a bunch of modules that you can go and play with. And these things range from chatbots to language translators to summarizations to product name recommendation engines, all sorts of weird and wonderful things that are actually not entirely novel. A lot of these things actually existed already in the market. The thing for me that stands out with GPT-3 is two things. A, the performance of these. So if anyone here has had an invite, you'll hopefully be able to test the fact that the accuracy of these is pretty amazing, actually. You can pretty much click any of these. There's a little prompt, type in some text, click a button, and it goes. And it's pretty much nailing the task that you're trying to get done. The second thing, and probably the slightly more powerful element of this, is how little configuration this requires for all these different purposes, and this is growing by the day. Keep in mind that these aren't fine-tuned for these tasks, right? This is another thing that is commonly a big problem with machine learning models, is that they're fine-tuned for one of these individual tasks, whereas all of these modules leverage GPT-3 and the training data that I was trained on. Little Turing test joke for the computer science buffs in the room. So I think the most popular use case is also one of the most useless ones, to be honest with you guys, which is chatbots and conversational type of interfaces, question and answering. I think this goes back to what I started with human language and conversation being such a core aspect of the human experience. I think there's just an inert fascination that people feel pushed towards. And I think, even myself, I've played with chatbots for many years. The first thing I did when getting this was asked it loads of stupid questions. So, sort of demo. This is kind of what the UI this is exactly what the UI looks like. I actually screen capped a conversation I had very recently about it, and I wanted to show you guys the output and kind of talk through actually what's happening there from a slightly deeper perspective. Keep in mind what I said about not getting overexcited before, but I quite like seeing the performance. So you've all seen the trick here. This is not, in fact, my talk. Well, it is really clever. But I was trying to get a few guidelines basically as to what might look decent, and I figured who would know as much as possible about this? GPT-3, of course. So this was his response to my original question around tips. Pretty high level. It's cut off, which is a bit of a flaw in the interface actually. There are following points. That's not it being done. I kept this brief because I didn't want to fill up loads of text and bore you guys with loads of text on screen. But I promise you, it was following up with loads of amazing, wonderful points. I asked it another question. What should I focus on to make the talk interesting? Gave me a slightly more detailed answer there, explaining the motivation behind the invention, illustrating how it improves on previous models. Tick. When discussing these improvements, begin with the final model in the paper. I don't know if I've done that, but generally, I'm still pretty happy with this answer there. Keep in mind all this, grammatical correctness, punctuation, all of that is, you kind of get it out of the box, regardless of your purpose. I was kind to you guys. I didn't want this to be too boring. I figured, also tell me how to make them lol. And I can set up a live demo, walk through it with the audience, and that's basically what I've done there in a slightly roundabout way. But again, I thought that was a pretty good tip. Final question, most important one, and the true Turing test. And actually, I'm going to also test you guys. Quick show of hands, who's taps in this room? And okay, so actually probably about 50. Let's see how GPT-3 reasoned about this. Play it hard to get first. Play it hard to get. And it's right, actually, it is a choice. So technically the correct answer. Spaces is apparently how the code base was coded in. And last but not least, I gave it a true human emotion and told it that I was disappointed. I'm a taps guy, obviously. and it gave me a bit of sark back, which I was writing this really late, and it was like running close to deadline. I didn't find it that funny at the time. It's funny now. So this is pretty cool, pretty awesome. Again, out the box, I did not do any setup here. This is genuinely the conversation. And I'll talk about a few things. So firstly, I originally wanted to do this demo actually live. I wanted to just go on the interface right now, launch it up outside of internet worries and a few other things I thought would be worth your time. It's important to remember that this is non-deterministic. I can't guarantee, no one can guarantee the output of this. There's inherent randomness in this. Doesn't make for very good presentation if sometimes you get an output that's a little bit crap, essentially, which does happen. Sometimes it's a little bit funnier, sometimes less funny, sometimes they're more brief, sometimes a little bit longer. Generally, I wanted to make sure that I could capture something that I quite enjoyed, so I gave it a few runs. But that point around non-determinism is quite a crucial one. Lots of our programming for commercial purposes, particularly when you take into account things like regulation or systems that are mission critical. You know, I wouldn't trust GPT-3 to tell me when to turn on my rocket booster in my SpaceX rocket. There's a whole fleet of actually really useful programming and commercial programming that this just is completely not useful for. You know, this is much more for things that are a bit more ambiguous, a bit more free-flowing. It also inherits from all of the BS and random nonsense that's on the internet, right? It's very blind, actually, to everything that it takes in. I think that's a problem from a programming perspective, but actually even from a sort of more moral perspective. You know, there's all sorts of illnesses and things that probably we wouldn't ideally have captured in our web sphere that this is naturally going to inherit. And there's also just generally a bunch of minefields, like who owns the content that this generates? You know, who actually is at the source of, you know, if this generates a book, who owns the rights to that book? Is it the developers? Is it the program? There's a huge kind of minefield of moral and ethical and legal complexities that I'm sure this is going to open up eventually when people start commercializing this more. But generally, currently, for fun and lols, it's great, actually, at the very least. Really important and final point that I'm going to try and really articulate really clearly. The program has zero understanding of English, language, grammar, AI, GPT-3, conversations, grammar. It's literally just looking at strings of characters and predicting output. It's really important to understand that, right? So to be a bit more upfront about this, in the text that this was trained on, there will be loads of scripts that are written in the start where there's a character followed by a colon, followed by a string. It just learns that pattern and it recognizes that and it says, okay, well, I know this is sort of like conversational type convo. I'm going to stick to that structure. Grammar, again, just comes from statistics. It seems billions, and maybe even trillions of words. It just knows what words are likely to come up next to each other. It doesn't understand the rules of grammar. You know, if you asked it, what is the next logical word here? No idea. You know, this is just really awesome pattern matching. That's kind of how I look at it. Even things like, you know, AI, GPT-3, it's just read loads of articles. It kind of knows roughly how things are related to each other, and it's using probability to gauge what makes sense and what looks kind of realistic. So it's only been out for a year, but people have already started doing some interesting things. So copywriting is one example. This company, WriteSonic, has been using GPT-3 to basically offer an interface for people that want to generate copy and that sort of stuff. There's a very similar company, very cleverly named, very creative, that does basically the same thing. Very early days, however, I'm sure we'll see a few more interesting things in the long-term future. And what does that long-term future look like? Well, actually, I do think we've already started seeing some of this in some of our tool sets. And has anyone here seen when Gmail autocompletes for you? Yeah? That is basically language problems, right? That's exactly the same thing. It's taken its data set of emails and it generates a probability of what's likely to follow up. It's quite humbling. It makes you realize that we're all kind of like the same, really. Like we're all writing the same emails. But generally, I think that integration into existing tools to allow ourselves to become more proficient content editors, content writers, content correction, content summarization. I think that one's probably the next one that's going to be a bit bigger. But I think that's just going to be normal, integrated into all our text editors, all our email devices, all of our chat devices, and really leverage its power to allow us to just be a bit more efficient in that domain. I really like this idea of like a fuzzy search engine interface. I can't, for me, this solves like the multi-tab problem. Like I'm sure other people in here, if you're reading something new, you open up like 20 tabs, Wikipedia, Google, and you kind of read a little bit from each. This solves that. So the way I honestly was using this, even while writing this presentation, I would just ask it questions. And what that does actually is just gonna aggregate the average of all the information that's been trained on. So that's kind of what I mean by fuzzy search engine. It kind of gives you a nice approximation of all the data that's learned. And it's awesome because it actually creates unique and novel representation of that result, right? You keep that in mind as well. However, I am biased, and this is DDD, developer, and the only thing I'm interested about is how can I retire early? How can it do my job for me? How can this code for me? Again, maybe not necessarily useful in the long term, although it arguably is, but I certainly think that's probably one of the most exciting aspects of how this can be applied, particularly given my bias. And I say they, I mean OpenAI recently released a specific series for coding type tasks. This got two things that I'm really, really excited about. One is obviously a code generation tool from natural language, and the other one is a sort of code summarization tool for code, essentially. I'm going to try my best to show you how that looks like. They are API first, by the way, and this is a realistic code sample of what you can do to activate one of those modules via code. They've got this term of completions, which kind of makes sense if you go back to that whole providing input, completing outputs. So everything is a completion. Every single module, it just completes an input, right? Again, going back to that, it's not understanding the task that it's doing, it's not solving any problems, it's just completing an input based on some output. Sorry, completing output based on some input. We've got a few different engines that you can use. This one's DaVinci Codex, which is the one used for code problems. You can provide it with a prompt, which is basically your input. There's a few different parameters you can tweak, things like randomness. You can penalize the algorithm for showing up words too many times. You can kind of control actually some of the output with some level of certainty, but honestly it's a bit of an art for myself. And a few other things you can do that I'm not going to talk about right now. However, I'm going to try my best to demo what that codex looks like. So I've kind of given away that I'm a software developer at heart, even though I go to a lot of meetings nowadays, more so than code. But what I do is basically create a lot of CRUD interfaces at its core. You know, I don't try and dress it up in anything more fancy than that. I think a lot of developers in here empathize with that, but a lot of it is creating user input forms and making sure we capture that data sensibly, adding rules to that. Maybe not the most exciting, but I kind of love it. I'm that kind of guy. And I tried to give this a test for GPT-3. So this is the interface for Codex. I gave it an input down below, which is basically what I just said, create a user input form, taken a user's name and date of birth, you know, a very common thing that we would do, and generate some code for me, some JavaScript that I love so much. And it's coming up on the right there, and also the output of that comes up on the left. This wasn't good enough for me. I want some validation rules in there. So create a configurable rule processing engine, which is weirdly phrased, but I know what that means. Just trust me. And then I wanted to execute that as a function, so I told it to do that. Okay, cool. I can sort of see it. Let me actually pause that just for 1 second. Hopefully that works. That did not work how I thought it would. Okay, well, maybe I won't pause it. But those rules, it's not quite what I intended. So I wanted functions, giving me kind of an object there that has functions. Fine. I'm going to try and tell it to combine those rules into the input form so I can basically interact with that using those rules. Not bad, not bad. I can sort of see what it's doing there. I want to export it to JS Fiddle and try and actually execute that. Right, so I'm going to put in my name. Does anything come up? It looks like it's reasonably functional from a UI perspective. However, the rules are not executing. We're safe. We are safe. It writes bugs, and actually the UI is not amazing either. Don't tell it I said that. But generally, I thought this is pretty impressive, actually, based on the limited amount of information and context I've provided it. I'm just going around there, just trying to break it in more ways, just trying to see if I can get those alerts to trigger. Not quite, even though, as I said, I think from a time perspective, I thought this was quite impressive. So the second part of this, and the part that's slightly more interesting for actually what my job is nowadays, which is actually reading code more so than writing it, is code summarization or code understanding. So I'm actually going to feed this code back to itself. Hopefully that's moral, and no one here feels a bit weird about that. But similar module, similar interface, and I basically copied and pasted that code, and I told it, break down what that function is doing for me, and I want to try and see if I can spot where the bug is, which maybe is a bit of a long shot, but that's where the prompt is, and it's going to generate output there based on that prompt. There's a bunch of things going on here that I'm not going to go into, but basically if you focus on the text up to where, basically where I've scrolled into there, it's basically going through that code that's written itself, remember, and it's trying to break down line by line what's happening, create a form element, create rules object, add an event listener. I mean, all of this is actually accurate. You know, if I were to go back to this, that would essentially be a step-by-step walkthrough of those different functions with not a huge amount of detail, but again, keep in mind you can tweak the parameters here and there to try and give you slightly more random deterministic outcome, slightly less deterministic outcome. But generally, I think this, given 3 or 4 years, I could see how this could be really good integrated in the code editor when you're reviewing QRs, getting a bit of guidance on how things are going on. Again, it doesn't need to be 100% right? As long as it's giving you a rough outline of how things can go. The sort of thing I could imagine being incredibly powerful, given a bit more time for accuracy. Code generation, I'm a little bit more skeptical about, and I think you guys have seen some of the nuance of that. Particularly if you go back to what I said with the regulation, I work in mortgages, so that's like a minefield basically and a no-no. But generally, I do think this is probably useful from a more learning perspective and from more prototyping perspective. Having a sort of rough template of what you're going to be doing, going to be coding, and filling in the blanks using your very useful and sought after human brains. So, at its crux, one of the most powerful things for me with machine learning in general, actually, but with GPT-3 and machine learning models such as that, it's kind of a shift from our traditional logical way of programming, where you say, if this, then that. Basically every program is a mixture of if this, then that at its core. What I love about this, it allows you to say, if this looks like this, then it's probably that. Quite a subtle change in that sentence, but actually massively powerful, right? The human world is filled with things that sort of look like things. Most things are not as strictly and unambiguously defined as we like our data structures to be. Images, sound, video, all these things are great examples of that. If you want to make a program that can tell if a cat is on the screen, going through and sort of having an if this pixel is in that position would probably take quite a long time and not be the most fun job. But if you could say, hey, if it sort of looks like that, then it's probably that. You can imagine that that's actually quite a human-like way of navigating a program or logic in general. So hopefully that has not scared you too much, and hopefully that's given you some good insight into what the long-term future might look like, or possibly not look like. As I said, we're really early in this journey. I'm really, really curious to see how GPT-3 and GPT-X evolves over the long term. But I think this is really fun, and you have to remember that actually fun things are worth doing, even if this is not the future of programming. I think there's some human insight you can glean from playing around with this sort of stuff. I'm a little bit ahead of time, which is weird because I practiced this, but at least this gives you guys a good amount of time for questions, but that's pretty much at the end of things. Thank you very much. Any questions at all?
I have a question.
Yes.
How long did it take you to get access to the OpenAI GPT-3 beta?
About 2 months, if I remember correctly. Quite a
Well,
while.
I've been on the waiting list for like a year. And I don't know what happened. Maybe I shouldn't have told them I wanted to use it to write songs.
Crucial error, yeah, you can't.
I'll hit them again.
Fair enough.
Cool, thanks.
No problem. Yes?
So if you have a same input being fed into this, will the output be always the same?
No. So that's actually one of the core parts. You can tweak, remember previously there's a few parameters you can tweak, like penalization of terms coming up at a certain frequency. So basically you can tell it, hey, if the term comes up a lot, don't use that output. You can sort of tweak certain things, but at its core, there's no true way to guarantee that you're gonna get the same outcome. There's certainly things you can tweak to probably mean that you're gonna get the same outcome most of the time, but there's no algorithmic or guaranteed way where you'll be able to guarantee that every single time.
So you say it's still being constantly trained?
Yeah, to this day, still being trained with new news articles and new data.
Kind of guarantees that you might not necessarily get the same answer.
Absolutely, really good point, actually, yeah. The parameters are constantly being updated, the weights of the model constantly being updated. So you're right, it's constantly going to generate slightly different output, even if you're not tweaking some of the parameters. Yeah.
I actually put my question up on the slides.
Oh, yes, I forgot I did that. Good point. Okay, so there's two questions, actually. Given output is based on training data, should we be concerned that this will just create a massive echo chamber where, because it comes from the computer, the public won't be prepared to question the output and we end up with common knowledge that is simply incorrect and or massively biased? Really, really great question.
That's my question. You work in mortgages.
Yeah.
You've probably all been in a bank and said, can I have a mortgage? And tap, 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 computer says no.
Yeah.
If we're training this with bad data,
Yeah.
is it not going to be an echo chamber, or is this it's come from the computer, so it's got to be right? Go question it.
Yeah, yeah. So I think your criticism is completely valid, and I think maybe touches back on what I mentioned before around the minefield of regulation and even moral kind of perspective. But this will inherit mistakes, absolutely. And you know, the team that has crafted the algorithm, the network topology, the path for this, the data, the training data itself, they've tried to take this into account. They've tried to discount things they thought might not be useful or might be morally questionable. But of course, at the end of the day, we're humans and we make mistakes, and there's still a layer of bias that is going to be transmitted through that selection process. So, yeah. Yes.
Does it have any way of like recognising if it's getting the same data from training? You know, like, so it's not reading the same thing over and over again and just reinforcing itself?
Good question, which I honestly don't know the answer for, because they don't expose that sort of functionality. Almost the network is a little bit closed off, so you can sort of tweak output, but actually the data selection process is much more ingrained that they give you any visibility for. I'm sure internally they've probably got some way to do what you're talking about, but as a user, so far they've not really swayed. But I think you could do that.
It's important to know I get the answer to my question.
Yeah, it is on there. I was going to get to it, I promise. So Zach's wonderful question. How long would you guess it will be before GPT-3 becomes something that works its way into being used in our everyday lives? I must know how long I have to wait until I can get GPT-3 microwave that can perfectly microwave a burrito that is both well cooked and won't burn the roof of my mouth. Two-part question, both of which are equally important. First one, very soon. I wouldn't be surprised actually if some of those Gmail auto-completion features use a GPT-like architecture, even if it's not GPT-3 itself. But I think that sort of thing's already pretty much there. Obviously, it's not massive, but it's that sort of thing. Getting GPT-3 to accurately microwave your burrito is milestones away. I mean, we're talking centuries at the very least. It's an age-old problem. I've tried to solve many times myself. I've wasted many nights. Still not there.
What's the future then? So this is number 3.
Yeah.
Are they working on number 4? Or is it training more data on number 3?
Good question. So I tried to find out the answer to this. That was also one of my questions. Not very much public data about it. They're very, very secretive as an organization. The closest thing you can get is Reddit, which I'm not going to quote as an accurate source. But based on projections, at least they think that if they were working on GPT-4, we'd be looking at 10 trillion parameters. If you kind of take the growth, and the Reddit community seems to think it's likely that they are working on this and just haven't said anything publicly about it. But I don't know.
You ask it.
At my booth, come, I will ask it and I'll show you. I don't want to do it now, but I will actually do it later, I promise. Any others?
Are there competing APIs or equivalents? And what sort of things would they be competing on?
So that's a really good question. So there's definitely no competing open APIs. I'm sure there's loads of labs, research groups, companies. I'm sure all the big companies probably have their own implementation of something very similar using, even if it's not GPT, they'll probably use Transformer as a network architecture, and they'll use the whole concept of pre-trained, use huge parameters, and use that to kind of leverage different things. But no one has released an API, very much like OpenAI has, even though theirs is invite only, so it's technically still not publicly accessible, but there's nothing publicly available yet that I'm aware of anyway. Maybe someone else is familiar with any others, but I haven't seen anything yet, no.
Does it have scope for the
the tone of voice of what it says? Is that something you need?
So that's a complicated question. My short answer is no. You know, tone for me is kind of one of those things that, you know, I've strictly put in human count. Like it picks up on statistical probabilities of words coming up with each other, and you know, it's kind of like a blurred line between that. Like actually, you know, if you are capturing a certain tone, there is a probabilistic number of words that just come up more frequently towards each other. Someone could maybe argue that is tone, just in a slightly weird representation. But it really, if you asked it, what is this tone? I'm surprised I think you'd probably get some nonsense answers. You know, I'd probably look at what it's been trained on and give you some sort of like textbook definition. I don't think it would really understand the nuance of words having certain tones, and obviously the nuance of people having different interpretation of words, and how those tones can differ by culture, where you are, how old you are. Those sorts of nuances, I think, is just completely beyond the scope of what GPT-3 can do, if I'm being honest.
As far as you know, has it mainly been trained on just English text?
Yeah, as far as I know, English news wire text. I actually asked GPT this question just to double check, and it seemed to think it was predominantly English. Although I haven't actually tried it in a different language. It's another thing I need to try. Come to my booth later to find out what my sister used.
So do you think it's kind of reflecting an average across all English stuff on the internet, but not reflecting anything from French, German, Spanish, Chinese?
So actually, I'm going to go back on my own answer, because one of the things it can do is translate text from one language to another, right? That is one of the modules that you can go and do. I can't see any way for it to do that if it wasn't trained on text that wasn't English. I mean, my guess, because I haven't actually looked this up, is that actually it was trained on a lot of like English to French dictionaries and things of that nature. Maybe not actually, you know, maybe it wasn't trained on other languages, news articles, but actually it probably has a lot of translation articles within there anyway that covers a bunch of languages. And I can only say that actually because I've used some of the translators and they're pretty good. So yeah.
Do you know, like, they've got anything, because obviously it's going to be a concern, but like, if they're already doing anything to sort of like explain how it made its like predictions, or how you would say it, or justify its answers?
Yeah.
Is there anything that they're doing in that?
So definitely not from a technical perspective, but that is part of their mission statement. That's, you know, they have texts about this and they have conversations about this, and you know, honestly, that's kind of the mission of the company. Rather than offering an API interface, is to make sure actually that we can explain it, it's shared, it's publicly available. But definitely, if you look at any Sam Waltman's interview on this, the big mission is making sure they can also have really good explainability behind the outputs that are provided. Any more? All right, well, thank you very much for your time.